interview with Professor Eric Schwitzgebel, a philosopher whose work explores consciousness, moral psychology, and the strange limits of self-knowledge. He's the author of The Weirdness of the World, and his research asks why ethicists don't always act more ethically, why introspection can mislead us, and how we should think about AI consciousness before science gives us clear answers. You can read more about Professor Schwitzgebel on our website, 6degrees.blog, or our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy the interview.
What first drew you into philosophy, and how did you realize that this was the kind of thinking you wanted to do for a living?
I think back in middle school, I was interested in philosophical questions. I didn't really think of them necessarily as philosophical, or at least as philosophy as a profession so much back then, but my friends and I would argue about what makes art good or stupid and whether the world exists outside of that door and how you would know and stuff like that. And so when I came to college, I found that the classes in philosophy resonated with something in me.
So, in your work on cheeseburger ethics, you ask whether people who study morality actually live more morally. So, what did that project teach you about the gap between knowing what is right and actually doing that?
Right. So, mostly collaboratively with Joshua Rust, we did a series of studies looking at lots of different measures of moral behavior between where we could compare professional ethicists, that is philosophers who specialize in ethics, with comparison groups of other philosophers, and also with professors in fields other than philosophy in the same universities. So we looked at a wide variety of measures, and over again, we found the ethicists didn't seem to behave much differently than anybody else. And one of the most striking, but sometimes they had more demanding moral opinions.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the most striking results, you mentioned cheeseburger ethics, one of the more striking results was on vegetarianism, where we found that ethicists were substantially more likely than other professors to say it's morally bad to eat meat. But when we asked them to report whether at their previous evening meal, not including snacks, did they eat meat, or the meat of a mammal in particular we used in that question, they responded about the same rate as the other professors. So there's a pretty big difference in expressed moral attitude, but little to no difference in self-reported behavior. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we found, and I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I'm still not quite sure exactly what to draw from all this. But it does seem like spending your life thinking about philosophical ethics tends, not on average, to have much influence on a person's behavior, which I find kind of disappointing. It might have some influence. I mean, there are some plausible cases where it seems like some people are influenced. It's hard to. I don't think it's totally inert, but the influence is much more tenuous and maybe less unidirectional than you might have thought.
Wow. So, yeah, the cheeseburger one, that's really interesting. I mean, so all these professors are preaching, and then at the same time, it's really, I don't know, it's really interesting. I mean, anybody would assume that a professor of ethics would be pondering all these questions, just thinking to think.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few different ways of thinking about it. Let me tell you a story that's sometimes told about Max Scheler, who was a prominent philosopher and theologian in the early 20th century. So he was known for his inspiring religious and ethical writings. He was also known for being a really horrible person. He was such a bad sexual harasser that he got he was permanently banned from teaching in Germany.
Wow.
This is in the early 20th century. The bar was probably pretty high in that time and place. Just as an example. So anyway, this and a distressed admirer once approached him after he'd been thrown out of Germany, and I think he was teaching at Harvard at the time. What do you have all these inspiring writings, but in your life you don't seem to live that way? And Shaler was apparently undisturbed, and he said, "Well, the sign that points to Boston doesn't have to go there." And I don't know. I find that a pretty disappointing answer. So, yeah, I've been working on a project for a while and trying to figure out exactly how to lay my finger on why that's disappointing. Of course, it's disappointing when anyone doesn't behave ethically. And of course, we don't like hypocrisy.
Of course.
But I don't think those two things exhaust it. Because Shaler, in a way, you might say he's not a hypocrite. I mean, he could put a little preface on the front of everything and say, look, I don't live this way, right? So he's not like hiding necessarily his bad behavior, right? So it's, we normally think of hypocrisy as involving, presenting yourself one way, but really being another. And that's not necessarily what's going on. So, yeah, I want to think more about exactly what's kind of right in what Shaler says, but also I think there's something seriously missing in what Shaler says. So I haven't yet thought that through to my satisfaction.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in terms of like what you've argued that ordinary introspection is unreliable or often unreliable.
Yeah.
What convinced you that people are like frequently wrong about what's going in their minds?
There's really two answers to that question. One is what convinced me autobiographically, and another is what convinced me really once I started thinking about it. Autobiographically, what it was I was a developmental psychology / philosophy student, and I was struck by how the philosophers said people have great knowledge of their own experience. Often, this is in the 90s, philosophers would say you can't even possibly get it wrong about what your current experiences are. And then in developmental psychology, I was finding that children were seem to be making all kinds of mistakes about what their experiences are if you ask them. Mm-hmm. We could get into some cute examples of that if you want. But what really convinced me when I started looking at it more seriously as a research question was the history of introspective psychology and philosophy. And when you look at the history of what people have said about what experience is like, it's wild what people will say. That you look back in the 19th century or the early 20th century, people are saying all kinds of things that don't resonate at all today about their experience, seemingly very confidently. And people will report very different things, even now, about what their experience is like, that don't seem to really track with how they behave or with differences in physiology or behavior. And I think the most plausible general explanation for this wide variety of self-reports, these wide differences in self-reports, is that people are maybe surprised to a surprising degree, not very good at thinking about what their actual stream of experience is. And if you think about it a little bit, in a certain way, maybe it's not surprising that we should be bad at knowing these things. I mean, what do you really need to do in order to get through the world, right? You need to get it right about external objects and about social situations, right? The stream of experience is not necessarily something that you need to crack to do well in an evolutionary or social context.
Yeah, so what you're trying to say is like that the stream of experience is like you don't need to know what's really like going on in order to be a functioning member of society, I guess.
You need to know what's going on out there, but you don't necessarily need what's going on in here. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So just one example of this, that one of the first examples I looked at, I think it was the first example I systematically looked at, was the history of people's reports of black and white dreaming. So when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, a common question that you people asked each other was, hey, do you dream in color or black and white? People kind of thought this was a fun question to talk or argue about. And now nobody asks that. And if you ask ordinary people, they kind of like look at you a little funny and say, well, color, of course. And before the 20th century, if you look at the history of reports of dreaming, there doesn't seem to be any skepticism about people dreaming in color. There wasn't really a thought that they might dream in black and white to kind of be opposed, but it was just kind of look at dream reports, dream descriptions. No one's saying, yeah, dreams don't have color. So what seems to have happened was, starting in the early 20th century and then peaking around 1950, people started thinking they dreamed black and white. And this corresponds very nicely with the rise of black and white film media, especially movies. Mm-hmm. And so what seems to be going on is that people over-analogize their dream experiences to movies. And in the era where movies were mostly black and white, people kind of thought their dreams were black and white. You see, so the large majority of people in the 1940s and 1950s said they dreamed primarily in black and white, and color was a rare phenomenon if it occurred at all.
So the people were actually dreaming in color. It was just that they thought, because they thought of their dreams as a movie.
So that's an interesting question. So I don't think people dreamed very differently then than they do now. And if you look at like written dream reports and you compare the rates at which color terms appear in dream reports from that era with the rate at which color terms appear in dream reports from the 90s and the early 2000s, about the same. Uh-huh. But I also wouldn't assume that people dream in color, right? It might be when you say that you're over-analogizing to movies.
Yeah.
Right. So think about like a novel. Would you say a novel is in color? Well, it's not. It's kind of like the wrong kind of question to ask whether a novel is in color or it's in black and white. Of course, some of the objects in novels have colors, right? If someone's chopping a carrot, you assume it's orange, right? And they could describe the car as red or whatever, right? But like a novel is not a pervasively colored thing, and yet at the same time, it's not a black and white thing. I mean, of course, the text on the page might be black and white, but that's a different kind of question. Mm-hmm. So it could be, I'm not saying this is the case, right? But it could be that the case that dreams are kind of like that they're kind of neither colored nor black and white most of the time. And both us and they are over-analogizing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Confuses you, yeah. So I guess this kind of goes into it. You have said that at the deepest level, reality is philosophically weird. And I thought that was really funny. What do you mean by this here, and why does it matter for how we should do philosophy?
Well, yeah, so this is the central idea of my most recent book, The Weirdness of the World. And at the heart of the book are two claims. One is what I call the universal bizarreness thesis, and the other is the universal dubiety thesis. And according to universal bizarreness, when it comes to fundamental questions about consciousness and cosmology, every live option is bizarre. There's no common sense possibilities left. Something weird must be true. But according to the universal dubiety thesis, we don't know which weird thing is the true thing among the various weird options, right? So the easiest and most familiar version of this, not the focus of my book, right, but to kind of sink your teeth into it, most people know that quantum mechanics is weird, right? So when it comes to interpretations of quantum mechanics, there are various options, like, for example, that the collapse of the wave function depends on an observer, right? So your observation, you open the box and Schrodinger's cat transforms from a juxtaposition of being neither alive, a juxtaposition of being both alive and dead at the same time in a certain way, to collapsing into one another just because you observed it, right? That's bizarre. I'm trusting that your listeners kind of know enough to know what I'm talking about here. Another option is many worlds, that the world is constantly splitting into alternative possibilities. And there are other options too, right? But when it comes to interpreting quantum mechanics, all the options are bizarre, and there's no compelling, I mean, you can favor one or over another, but there's no really truly compelling reason to land definitively on one of the interpretations. So that's bizarreness and dubiety. So I think when it comes to questions like how does consciousness arise out of the world, of what we usually think of as the physical world, and what is the size and nature of the universe? Those kinds of questions. I think there are no common sense options left, and we don't really know where the truth lies among the various possibilities.
So I guess this kind of talking about bizarreness, you sometimes explore possibilities like a nation being conscious or the world being a simulation. So what is one bizarre possibility you take seriously enough to spend time thinking about? And what does it value philosophically?
Well, you chose two of my favorites. And both of those, part of what I like about them is that you can use them to challenge ordinary scientific materialism. So my general instincts and predispositions are toward scientific materialism. The world is a bunch of material stuff. And that's the mainstream view in 21st century Anglophone science and philosophy. But certainly not everybody agrees about it. The group consciousness possibility shows, I think, one of the bizarre implications of ordinary mainstream materialism. So we don't have the time to go into detail on this. I certainly do in the book. I have a chapter on it. And then since the chapter is not get into enough detail, I have a whole appendix about it too, right? The general idea is that if you think of the United States as a concrete entity with people as its parts, kind of like cells or parts of your body, right? So don't think about it as a government. Think about it as like this big thing physically composed of like people. So it's kind of spatially scattered, right? So think of that concrete thing. It has all of the kinds of properties that ordinary scientific materialists say are special about brains, so that brains give rise to consciousness in humans, right? So there's massive information transfer among the components of this entity, right? People, right? It responds in intelligent ways to its environment, right? It imports bananas at a certain rate. It exudes foggy exhalations and then regulates those exhalations. It monitors space for asteroids. It exudes the pseudopod to Iraq, say, to invade Iraq, and this pseudopod, the army, does not crash into a mountain, but steers around it, right? So it communicates with other entities of its type, right? Like it threatens Iran, it cooperates with other entities in threatening Iran, right? So it's got, and I try to go through this somewhat more systematically in the chapter, it's got all of the kinds of properties that ordinary materialists tend to think conscious entities have. So then the question arises, okay, so we normally don't think that there is like literally a further consciousness over and above the consciousness of all the individual people who compose a country. But like, why not? Like, is there like, do we have a consciousometer that we could put up against the United States and it's reading 0? I mean, it's an intuition we have, but intuitions in this area might not be very reliable, right? When you start looking at physics and cosmology, right, our intuitions fall apart in a lot of cases. So it's not clear why we should confidently not conscious. It seems like the most straightforward thing to conclude on standard materialist views is that there is consciousness at the group level. Mm-hmm. So that thinking about that case is one way of illustrating what I think of as the bizarre implications of materialism.
Yeah.
Right. So remember the universal bizarreness thesis, I want to say all of the options are bizarre. I think we don't appreciate often all of the bizarre implications of kind of mainstream materialist view of how consciousness arises out of the physical world. So I think that is one of those implications. Or the materialist, I think, can kind of dodge that implication, but only by accepting some other kind of way out, some wiggle room that then has other bizarre implications. So it's a kind of dialectically complex situation. That's
So shifting a little bit in terms of like what you've talked about with AI. So you have warned that we may have to make moral and legal decisions about AI consciousness before we have good science about consciousness.
yes.
What principles do you think we should use to decide what to count as a conscious or morally considerable AI?
Right. So this is my book in draft, AI and Consciousness, which is available on my website, and anyone's free to read it and give me comments and get a thank you in the appendix. I'm hoping to get this submitted to the press early in 2026. So, right. I think that consciousness science, I think it's pretty clear that consciousness science is highly contentious and not very advanced. We really don't know how consciousness arises out of the physical or seemingly physical world. We don't really know very well, even among animals, which animals have conscious experiences and which don't. There's a lot of debate right now about whether, say, bees have experiences or not. And there's a huge range of theories about consciousness. So I think it's pretty clear. I mean, we're almost already there that we're going to have some AI systems, AI companions, maybe, that according to some scientifically respectable, mainstream, serious theories of consciousness, really have conscious experiences and are as conscious and as capable of pleasure and pain as we are. And at the same time, there will be other equally respectable, equally mainstream scientific approaches that say, no way, these things are no more conscious than a toaster. It's just you're falling for an illusion. And we won't know which of these theories is right. And that will create a major social dilemma because we'll have entities that some people really, for legitimate reasons, think, hey, this is like a person. This entity has rights. It deserves to be taken seriously and not unplugged or changed without its permission, and maybe given a path to citizenship and the vote and the right to work and the right to reproduce. Right? And other people say, this is an empty puppet show of mimicry. This is nothing. And we won't know who's right. So my first suggestion here, which I call the design policy of the excluded middle. So this is developed in work with Mara Garza. And the design policy of the excluded middle says, don't create morally confusing entities like that if you can avoid it. Right? Try to create entities that you know aren't moral persons, that everyone could kind of agree, yeah, this thing doesn't meet the standards for deserving serious rights. Or maybe possibly someday go all the way to creating something that everybody can agree, or almost everybody, all reasonable people on mainstream theories can agree, yeah, this thing does deserve rights, is a person, and then treat it like a person. To avoid these confusing middle cases. That's the design policy of the excluded middle. Of course, I don't think that the world will follow that advice. I think we'll create things in the middle. And then that creates really a tragic dilemma. I don't want to use a criterion, right? I don't want to say, okay, here's the criterion for counting this thing as a person. That's where I think we're going to go wrong, because I just don't think a criterion can be justified.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how the future moves, how technology moves.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was reading your blog earlier and I was like, you're worried about how philosophy majors, like, and how just liberal arts majors in general are just like decreasing and people just aren't interested and are not joining the same things that they used to. So you have studied whether taking philosophy and ethics course actually affects how people act. So, for example, in their choices about food or charity. So, what have you learned about when philosophy really changes lives and when it does not?
So, right, based on my stuff on ethics professors, my inclination has been to think, well, if teaching philosophy doesn't have much effect on the behavior of ethics professors, what are the odds it has effect on the behavior of like a student who takes one class? Seems like maybe not. And yet, I have found in some studies, and others have found in some studies, that there are some effects. The most interesting one actually is again on vegetarianism. So, in a series of studies with Brad Coquelet and Peter Singer, we exposed students to arguments for that eating factory farmed animals is immoral. And then other students were exposed to other philosophical arguments about charitable giving. And then we were able to look at their food purchases on campus, right? So not self-report, but like their actual receipts. And the people who had taken the class, who had been randomly assigned to the class on animal ethics, ate less meat afterwards, and as an effect that seemed to have lasted for several weeks or months. And there's another group at another university in Southern California who found something similar. And we replicated it, and it didn't seem to depend on using a factory farm videos or a highly emotionally engaging material. So yeah, that seemed to be a real effect, at least in the cultural context of maybe Southern California undergraduates in particular. Maybe they're, for whatever reason, especially receptive to that type of argument. And in other work, I've been looking, and this has been with Chris McVeigh and Fiery Cushman and Kirsten, and a few other people. We have exposed online participants to arguments for charitable giving and to emotionally moving narratives and that kind of thing. And what we've tended to find is that people are more moved to give to charity if they're exposed to an emotionally moving narrative about someone who's benefited by charity than if they're given an argument or statistics. But in some conditions, we find that relatively emotionally cool arguments and statistics can move people to give more to charity. So Kirsten Brody and Fiery Cushman and Jason Nemero and I have a paper on that's currently under submission, and some other researchers have found similar things. So I guess my inclination is to think that philosophical arguments don't tend to have much effect on people, but they can have a little effect. And maybe if it's the right argument to the right person at the right time, it can have an effect.
That's interesting, especially what you said about the food, how the students took a class and they started eating less meat, but the professors who were actually preaching it, that's crazy.
Yeah. There are some issues about statistical power here, right? So we did not find a statistically detectable effect for the professors to be eating less meat, the ethicist professors to eat less meat than the other groups. But, we had about 200 people per group. And we're just talking about one data point per person, your previous evening meal. And so the power to detect an effect is somewhat limited. And there was a replication in Germany that found that ethicists did eat less meat. So maybe there's a bit of an effect. But one thing's for sure, the difference in opinion is huge. The difference in behavior is maybe there, maybe not, definitely not huge. And the difference in student behavior. So we had more power there. We had more students. We taught, hundreds of students over multiple classes and multiple terms. So we had a lot more data points there. So that could be what's going on with that. It's a little hard. The data are complicated to analyze. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I mean, it's really interesting though.